Okay, this is a recorded interview just about 45 minutes before the start of Organic News on Tuesday, February the 2nd, with economist Richard D. Wolff, who is a visiting professor at the New School University, New York, and professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And you recently said that Bernie Sanders offers hope and change, hope for something better than the capitalism we have, and its worsening inequality, instability, and endless warfare, environmental outrages, and basic injustice. Bernie's democratic socialism is a change from all that to another New Deal. No real surprise that after Obama's promise of hope and change proved an illusion, something further left would take up the cry, responded to the need. And here's a thought: if Bernie is denied or blocked from delivering on his promises, movements further left will similarly emerge to respond to the need. And just lastly, the last quote says, the World Economic Forum in Davos obsessed, and rightly, over a global capitalism deeply mired in the iceberg of debt used to cope with the 2008 crash. The great fear is that the debt will cut off growth, produce deflation, and thereby increase the burden debt places on the system. Capitalism, the system, is in trouble. Of course, socialism then arise. They always were among the alternatives to consider when people find it urgent to do better than capitalism. So thank you for joining me, Richard D. Wolff.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Catherine.
Okay, so the first thing I want to ask you is, is what we have today capitalism? Because I don't feel like it really is capitalism. It's something much darker.
Well, in my judgment, yes. We are living in what capitalism has become. There are a variety of capitalisms, for sure. Capitalism has not always been in the form that it is now. But I don't find much persuasive in the notion that there's some beautiful or ideal capitalism that this is some deviation from. There are very good reasons why capitalism evolved in the way that it did. I think it is wishful thinking to imagine that this capitalism could somehow be made to go backwards and become some kind of lovely, clean, or pristine capitalism. I don't really think capitalism ever was that way, but whatever it was before is in the past. We got the capitalism we have now, and for me, that's the problem. What we have now is a capitalism that has evolved over a fairly long period of time, both in the United States and abroad, and has produced, as the quotation you read said, a set of conditions which I believe any reasonable person would have to say are fundamentally unacceptable if you believe in social justice, if you believe in democracy. I mean, the Oxfam institution in Britain, the oldest and most respected institution in the world that studies poverty around the world, issued its 2016 report a couple weeks ago, in the middle of January. And they found two things that capitalism has now produced. Number one, the 62 richest people in the world, most of whom, by the way, are Americans, the 62 richest people in the world together have as much wealth as the bottom half of the population of our planet, roughly 3.5 billion people. Let me say that again. The 62 richest have more wealth than 3.5 billion, the poor half, of this planet. You'd have to go back to ancient Egypt to get a level of inequality of that caliber.
And
the second thing Oxfam reported, another way of getting at the same statistic, is that the richest 1% in 2015, for the first time, owned more wealth than the other 99%. The 1% have more than the other 99%. This, again, is fundamentally incompatible with any notion of social justice, of equality, of liberty, of anything else that Americans say they are committed to. We can't be surprised that the 1% buy the political system because they don't want politicians by political means to undo the absurd wealth they've gathered into their hands by means of the capitalist economic system which they preside over. So for me, it is obvious how and why people looking at this situation, shaking their heads in a mixture of disbelief and disgust, are becoming interested again in socialism simply because it's an alternative. They're just at the point of exploring it. After all, here in America, we've had 50 years, half a century, in which socialism was a taboo. When you couldn't talk, you could more sooner talk about sex and religion and other taboo topics than you could talk about socialism. And that's why the Bernie Sanders campaign is such a breakthrough in American politics. And if you look at the results of the Iowa vote on the 1st of February, 85% of people 26 years of age and younger voted for Bernie Sanders. Wow. There you see that the young people facing a disastrous capitalism are well on their way to bringing socialism back into the political picture.
There was a pretty big march on Saturday, for Bernie Sanders, New York City, and, over 2,000 people came out. I was there, and, they marched from Union Square down to Zuccotti Park. A lot of people, this one friend that I know who's a Hillary supporter thinks, again, Bernie Sanders can't win because of his age.
Yeah, well, I don't find this very impressive. In 2008, a large number of people believed that Barack Obama could never become the candidate because A, he was black, and B, he had a name that didn't sound like John Smith or Harry Brown or other typical American name. Nobody named Barack Hussein Obama and who was black. All of that was wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it was wrong because we're facing a capitalism that doesn't work for the majority of people. And as they slowly and hesitantly and with a great deal of anxiety begin to change and move, which is always difficult for people, they are going to turn against old line politicians because they rightly associate those old line politicians with keeping the system going. And that's a system they don't like anymore. That's why Jeb Bush disappearing as a Republican candidate. Look at the New York Times, as traditional an institution as you have in the United States. They supported John Kasich in the Republican primary. He barely exists there, got 2-3% of the vote. And they endorsed Hillary Clinton, and she's barely got half the vote. The New York Times is wrong. They didn't support Mr. de Blasio for mayor. They were wrong again. They are trying to hold on to something that is self-destructing even as they hold on to it. And I'm afraid your friend has latched his or her affections onto a Hillary Clinton, and she represents the past, the holding on, the unwillingness to make the changes. Bernie Sanders is willing to make the changes. And the age of the people who came out overwhelmingly for him is a sign that the old is, coming to the end of its days.
Right. Thank God.
Yes.
How did socialism get this bad rap? Before I started the recording, we were talking a little bit about health, which is kind of, I speak about like how. I never really studied economics or politics. I was very, very passionate about health because at an early age, I could already see that money and the economy were kind of going in the opposite direction of health. and just, your healthy growth and development was going one way, and you had to sacrifice that in order to have money.
Well, I think the answer is fairly straightforward. In in the 1930s, this capitalism that is now in such deep trouble was, if anything, in even deeper trouble. We had the Great Depression from 1929 to 1941. And what was really interesting was that unemployment soared to 25%. You had a chaos in this country, the breakdown of capitalism. And the American people did something then they have not yet done. They really rose up and said, this won't do. We will not accept this unemployment. We will not accept this poverty. We will not accept an economic system that is good for a tiny number and horrible for the rest of us. So suddenly, they joined unions by the millions. They joined socialist parties and communist parties. And suddenly, those folks, numbering in the tens of millions of Americans, basically went to the president at that time, Franklin Roosevelt, and said, listen, Mr. Roosevelt, we're the people who voted you in. We're not going to vote for you anymore unless you help us. And in fact, if you don't help us, not only won't we vote for you, but you're likely to see a revolution in this country the way they had one in Russia. So we advise you to do something. And Mr. Roosevelt was a savvy politician, and he responded. So in the midst of the Depression, when there were no people working, or at least a quarter of our people were unemployed, when no government had any money because all those unemployed people didn't pay taxes, here's what they did. They created Social Security. Everybody over 65 is going to get a check for the rest of their lives. We never had that before. They created the unemployment compensation system. Everybody who's out of work, and at that time they were in the millions, would get a check every week for a couple of years to help them out. They passed the first minimum wage in American history. And then the really big one, Roosevelt goes on the radio and says, if the private capitalist sector won't provide jobs for the millions of Americans who really ask for nothing more than a job they can do, then I, as president, will do it. And from 1934 to 1941, he created and filled 15 million jobs. And here comes the punchline. How was the money gotten by the government to pay old people's Social Security checks, unemployed people's unemployment checks, and the salaries of all those millions of people the government hired? The answer was he taxed corporations and the rich.
Yeah.
Wow. Let me say that again.
Yeah.
He taxed corporations and the rich. That's why Bernie Sanders says he's another Roosevelt, because that's what he wants to do. That freaked out the corporations and the rich, but they couldn't do anything about it. So they lost out. They had to pay so that average people got through the Depression in a much better shape than they otherwise would. And when Roosevelt died in 1945, when the Depression was behind us, the business community and the rich went to work to undo all of that. And the major way they did it was by demonizing Roosevelt, demonizing socialism, saying that anybody who was a socialist was an evil person, an ignorant person, a traitorous person, a disloyal person, an agent of Moscow, whatever they could think of, anti-God, anti-religion, anti-family. They said everything they could, and it worked. It terrorized the American people. It made it impossible for anyone to be even interested in socialism, lest they be tarred with the brush. That's why we haven't had, for 50 years, a reasonable, honest, intelligent conversation.
But why?
Americans are proud that they question their school system and their transportation system. My God, in the last few years, we've been challenging what marriage means, whether it's between a man and a woman or two men and two women and all that. But we never have dared to question our economic system. You question capitalism, people look at you as something wrong with you.
Right.
Well, that is a terrible, childish, fearful ignorance we impose on ourselves. And that's why I think we haven't been able to have this conversation. And that's why Bernie Sanders is so important. That's why his campaign has already succeeded, no matter what happens to him. It has introduced into the American discourse once again that capitalism is something to be questioning and that socialism is something to be looking into as quite likely a better alternative. And for that, American history will be grateful to Mr. Sanders, and his age is completely irrelevant. Doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter whether he's there or not. He's, as he says himself, his job is to open up American politics, to overcome the childish, fearful, primitive self-ignorance about alternatives to capitalism that has been our way of conducting politics for the last 50 years. And I might say we're one of the few countries in the world that has that sorry history.
So what happened again? Like, what happened to the people? Because if they rose up and stood up to FDR, and then FDR went and taxed the corporations. I mean, and you just basically demonstrated that. So socialism, that term, but the actions of it actually work. I mean,
Sure they did.
Naturally, like you just described the bullying and the condemnation of the corporations on socialism. I mean, of course they're going to condemn it because it's not in their interest. Like, why would the people? Why would the people? Knowing that capitalism, doesn't work for them and wanting to get rid of it. Like, why would they allow themselves to be bullied by it when it clearly worked?
Well, first of all, most Americans, I mean, there's no way to say this politely, most Americans have no idea what socialism means.
Exactly.
They have an image in their minds of some bully dictator sitting far away, telling them what to do, where to do it, telling them they can't go to church, telling them they have an image that is a caricature. So that, for example, when I give speeches, I tell them, let me give you an example. I say to them, today in France, the government there is a socialist government. The Socialist Party put up a candidate for president. He won. He's now the president of France. The Socialist Party has the majority of delegates in the National Assembly. That's the equivalent of the American House of Representatives. And the Socialist Party also has a majority in the French Senate. In other words, the government of France is socialist, top to bottom. That's the way it is. Well, that's interesting. What have the socialists accomplished? Well, the socialists have been in and out of power in France many times over the last 50 years. Throughout the time that it was impossible in America to talk about it, the French people managed not only to talk about it, but to often vote socialists into power. And guess what? France didn't disappear, the country didn't dissolve, the Catholic Church, because it's a Catholic country, didn't close. But here's some of the things the socialists did, which when I tell it to Americans, comes as a shock and a surprise. Just a few examples. One, in the French system, because of the work of the Socialist Party, the following is the law. When anyone goes to work after finishing high school or finishing college, when you enter the labor force, your employer, for the entire time of your working life, your employer, whoever it is, must give you 5 weeks of paid vacation.
Sounds good.
Yeah, when I say this, the jaws of my audience here in America fall open. They can't believe what I just told them. Then I explained to them. The French working class said, we need time to be effective workers. We need time off. We need time for recreation.
Right.
We need time to be with our families. It's part of our mental health.
Right.
It's part of our physical health. And you are not going to deprive us of that to make more profits. And if you can't see your way clear to do that as a decent human being, we're going to make it a law so that if you don't give it to us, we're going to put you in jail. Well, it's been the law for decades. And even when the socialists lose elections so that conservatives come into power in France, they have not dared to question that law because they know that if they did, they would lose the next election in a big, ugly way. Let me give you another example. Every French citizen is covered by medical care insurance from the day you are born to the day you die. You will never be impoverished by an operation you have to have, or a chronic disease you suffer, or a child you choose to have, or anything else. Medical care is considered to be a right. It's like being able to go to the public park when you want to have a picnic. It's something you are entitled to because you are a living, breathing citizen of the country. I could give you more examples, but these are achievements of socialism. Let me give you a couple of others. In 1917, when the socialists made a revolution in Russia and took power, Russia was the poorest, most backward country in Europe. 95% of the people were illiterate. They worked the land, they were backward economically, politically, and culturally. Socialism not only brought this backward country into the modern world, but by 1975, literally 50 years later, Russia was a second global superpower after the United States. Socialism, which did a lot of bad things too, was nonetheless able to achieve a rate of economic growth unequaled in any capitalist country. Let me give you a final example. In 1949, one of the poorest, most backward countries on the face of this earth was China. In 1949, communists took over in China. There was a civil war. They won the civil war. They declared in 1949 the People's Republic of China, a backward, very backward, poor, rural, agricultural country. And here we are, 65 years later, and China is the second most important economy after the United States in the world. It was socialism that brought them that distance in such a short time. And when you remember that they are the largest country by population in the world, well over 1 billion people, that is 4 times the population of the United States, then it is even more of a stunning achievement. Only in America is it possible to conceive of socialism as if it were all bad and had nothing to its credit in its achievements. That's a childish, backward, ignorant way, and it just won't survive.
So again, like I go back to health and like, why don't we, really kind of call capitalism like what it is? I mean, it's extremely dysfunctional. I mean, it's gotten so, the scales are so imbalanced, and these corporations are literally like, I don't know, insane. I mean, Exxon funding its own climate change science to cover things up, and just, profit being the be all and end all. I mean, we have Correction Corporation of America and profiting off of putting people in prison. I mean, they created debtors' prisons in Michigan, and I think was a city in Washington. To
answer your question, in a sense, you've answered it yourself. Capitalism is a system that says to the people who run the businesses of America, the factories, the offices, the stores, that what you're here for is to make money. It's not your job to do what's socially useful. It's not your job to be a good neighbor. It's not your job to help people. If you can do that, it's very nice, but that's not your job. Your job is to grow the company, make the profits, build the enterprise. If you do that, you keep your job. If you don't do it, we fire you and replace you with somebody who understands the system. That's what they say to people at the top.
Yep.
The mass of people, sooner or later, and it's now happening sooner, are going to have to face the fact that what they are interested in is a decent life, able to live, to be healthy, to have good relationships, to have children, all the rest of it. They're not interested primarily in profit. The people who run this society have sold them a bill of goods.
Right.
Somehow, if you let the businesses maximize profit, it'll end up being the best for you too. That is, if you pardon my Spanish, bull. That's nonsense. That's a thin veneer that every person who's ever been out for themselves has tried to tell the people around them, look, let me be out here for number one myself, because that's what will work out to be the best for you too. Well, if you're gullible, you go along with it for a while. People have been going along with capitalism for quite a while. I think they now realize it just doesn't work. It's a hard thing if you haven't believed it. It's a hard change to come up with and face. But whether it's the horrible story of destroying those children in Flint, Michigan with the bad water, or it's a story of the addition of so much sugar to our processed food that we have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. I mean, wherever you turn, you see the effects of profit maximization costing the people. At a certain point, I am convinced that we will see a kind of generalized rising up in which years of seeing this finally come together and people say, it's enough, we won't tolerate it.
I really, really hope you're right. I mean, like what I just kind of heard you describing, it literally sounds like the corporations are like these drug addicts trying to get everybody else addicted to their drug, and did succeed for a really long time. You know, and people are starting to realize, you know, now, I guess, whatever, like they're crashing from this drug and all this high that they thought, you know, money was going to bring them.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, in Iowa on the 1st of February, the statistic is 85% of Democratic voters under 26 voted for Bernie Sanders. I don't think anyone should be surprised. This is the first generation of American young people to be told that they absolutely must go to college, otherwise they'll never get a good job, never have a decent income. So they work real hard, they go to college. Because of the bad economy, the only way to pay for college is to take out loans. So they're the first generation to graduate from college with tens of thousands of dollars in debt that they cannot repay, only to discover that the jobs they can now get are not very well paying. They're a betrayed generation. Yeah. You tell them that capitalism is a wonderful system that works like a charm, they will look at you as if you're nuts. And they will vote for Bernie Sanders because they're voting their own sense of betrayal by a system that clearly does not work for them.
You just made me think of this this article that I read that Chris Hedges had wrote about corporations wanting to get prisoners into debt while they're in prison. You know, so they get the person in prison, they charge them for things that normally used to be free, while paying them whatever it is, $1 or $2 a week for, you know, 8 hours a day of work. And then they can't ever leave because when their sentence is over, they're in debt, and so they're stuck there. I mean, it sounds like that's what they're doing to the whole country.
Exactly. And there's no end of this. Look, the last 30 years have been marked by another phenomena that American workers are going to one day face up to. They're beginning to already. Corporations decided they can make more money by closing their stores, their offices, and their factories here and opening them in China, because you can pay a Chinese worker much, much less than you pay an American worker. And the same is true of an African worker, a Mexican worker, an Indian worker, and so on. And so they just abandon American workplaces, leaving disasters, for example, like Detroit or Cleveland or Camden, New Jersey, places which, if you visit them today, look like bombed out cities because there's no work, because the people have left town, abandoned their homes, because they can't find the income from jobs to keep their homes. You know, that's our future as a country. Now it's limited to a bankrupt Detroit, to children with leaded water damaging their brains in Flint, to a disaster in Camden and Cleveland and so on. But that's the future of this country, and the question is only how much further will it continue to go before you see the backlash? Well, the answer is we're seeing it already. That's why Bernie Sanders isn't the candidate getting 2 or 3% of the vote, which all the people who looked at him when he first declared 5 or 6 months ago said he hadn't a chance, that anyone with a name Socialist is dead on arrival, blah, 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 blah. Well, here in the little state of Iowa on the 1st of February, a state with no particular radical orientation, no particular radical tradition, half the people who went to the polls in the Democratic side voted for Bernie Sanders. It's absolutely stunning what that tells you about where American politics is. And it's long overdue. And as many people have commented on American politics, it may take longer for the American people to kind of wake up and realize they've been had. But when they do, watch out, because they're going to be mighty angry when they figure out what a ride they've been taken on.
I hope I hope the scale isn't too tipped. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure. Let's do one more.
I wanted to ask you about the Federal Reserve and what the Federal Reserve's role is, because I just kind of wanted to focus on a little bit about what money actually is and where it comes from and how it's made, and that it's created out of debt. Everybody I hear on everybody talks about the wealthy and they're wealthy and they're wealthy, but I mean, money isn't even real wealth.
Okay, let me respond. The first thing is, and I know this is difficult because Americans, and I say this as a person who's been a professor of economics all my adult life. The level of economic literacy in the United States is so low that I can't even come up with a word that captures it.
Debt.
This is not the fault of the American people. Americans are as smart and as intellectually capable as anybody else. But there's no teaching of it. There's no education to speak of in this area. And of course, the mass media are full of confusing fragments. Nobody could learn anything by reading that stuff or watching it on TV. So having said that, the first thing to try to understand is that money is created mostly by banks. The way the bank does that is it says to a person, hello, would you like to open an account? Well, the person says, sure, I'd love to, but I don't have any money. Good, the bank says, no problem. We're going to give you a loan, and here's how it works. We're going to set up an account in the bank, and we're going to say, and I mean it, say that you have, let's say, $50,000 in this account. We're going to hit some keys on a keyboard of a computer, and bingo, wingo, you now have an account, and we're giving you $50,000 in your account, which means you can now start writing checks for up to $50,000 against your account, which we just created. It is a loan to you. So whatever you do with the checks, that's your business, but you're going to have to pay us a certain interest for as long as you keep this loan. Those checks that are now being written by you, that you got this account set up for you, that's part of money. Those checks are like money. They pay for your restaurant meal. They pay for your automobile you buy. They pay for your college education for your child or whatever. So the first thing to understand is that banks have the right to set up accounts like this by giving loans to any person or company they see fit to do that with.
And don't they expand the money supply? Like if somebody comes in and
by doing that. By doing that.
Yeah.
I simply say, okay, John, you have a $50,000 account. And you, Mary, you've got one. And you, Acme Ladder Company, you have $1 million. They set up the accounts, they send you the checkbook in the mail, and off you go, writing the checks that are just like money. Okay, so that's the first. The second thing is, banks have always abused this. They've given checks to people who can never pay it back.
Right.
That's now becoming dangerous because the bank has to spend money to set up an account, to keep records of the account, to mail out the money to the people you write checks to. The bank has expenses. If you don't pay them back, they don't earn anything, because the way they earn money is by getting back in interest more than they lent you in money. You have to pay them back the principal plus the interest. The interest is how they live. So the banks then become abusers. They give money to people who can never pay it back. This becomes dangerous. So over the history of banking, it became crystal clear that the economy as a whole could be seriously messed up when banks didn't behave properly. That's why if you read American history, the 19th century, they have every few years something called a bank panic. Here's how it worked. People who got wind of the fact that the bank was losing money because it had given loans to people who couldn't pay it back, they suddenly got scared that the money that they had earned in their job, which they had deposited in a checking account or a savings account at the bank, that the bank was going under and wouldn't ever give them back their deposits. So they would literally run to the bank to get their money out before it collapsed, which of course made the collapse happen even faster. So the end result was a decision by all the banks: we've got to have a supervisor. We've got to have some institution that kind of monitors us, that makes sure we're not misbehaving, that none of us abuses the system, because the whole system is in danger if some of us behave in the way we know profit will drive us to behave. So they set up, first, something called a central bank, the Bank of the United States, back early in the 19th century. By the way, this happened in other countries. If you go to France today, there's something called the Bank of France that runs the economy's banking system. If you go to England, it's called the Bank of England, and so forth. Here in the United States, for historical reasons, the first effort, the Bank of the United States, wasn't able to control the corruption, so it collapsed. So in 1913, when the need for another central bank became overwhelming because of bank panics, we created something called the Federal Reserve. It's a little over 100 years old. It's just a peculiar American name for the central bank of our country. And its job is to try to keep the lid on, to control the illegal, profit-driven excesses of the banks. By the way, it's not very successful. That's why we had a collapse in 1929. That's why we had another collapse in 2008. And in each case, the Federal Reserve rushed in to bail out the failed banks and didn't take them over, didn't close them down, didn't punish them.
Right.
Because its job isn't to fix and control the system, it's just to keep it from blowing itself up by excess profit mongering. That's why they bailed out the banks, and that's why they're all the same banks who were, quote, too big to fail in 2008. Every one of them is bigger now than it was then, and we have the same system heading towards the same breakdown, if not this year, then next year. It's amazing to watch another example of a capitalism out of control, but not yet confronting enough of a movement from below to bring this craziness to an end.
So you think, right, it is going to take an uprising from below.
Yep. I don't see any other way. The people at the top are still able to make these colossal mistakes like the 2008 meltdown.
Right.
To get bailed out by the rest of us as citizens so they can keep doing it, meanwhile earning their tens of millions of dollars a year. They have no incentive to stop. We have not given them an incentive to stop. By the inaction of the mass of people, you've in fact given them an incentive to keep right on going.
And then,
and that's what they're doing.
And then Occupy Wall Street comes along and, like, I mean, they got the rug kind of pulled out from underneath them too. I mean, you would think, like, so many more people would have joined in. I mean, there were a lot of people, but
Absolutely. Look, I mean, nothing was more illustrative of what's going on than here in New York to watch on that day when the bulldozers were brought in and bulldozed down the little free public library in Zuccotti Park,
yeah,
and the tents that had been set up, and the feeding of the homeless people, the tables that had been set
Yeah.
up. And who sent in the bulldozers that mowed them down?
Bloomberg.
The billionaire mayor of New
Yeah.
York City. I mean, you could.
Who wants to run for president, Till? My
Exactly.
God.
That's what I'm saying. We don't give these people an incentive to go and hang their heads in shame as they ought to.
Exactly.
We give them an incentive to imagine that they can keep running the system this way forever. And the truth of it is, they can for exactly as long as the mass of the people permitted.
That's
They didn't
why.
permit it in the 1930s, and it stopped
Yeah.
on a dime.
See,
And
that's.
the minute that, but by the way, the only thing I would disagree with you is I think Occupy was an enormous success because it proved to thousands of Americans
Yeah.
that they weren't alone, that they weren't the freak in the area who's critical, that they had lots of people who
Yeah.
thought like they did. They created the space and the momentum that is now showing up in support for Bernie Sanders. And if the government of the United States cannot, and the leaders cannot understand the link between Occupy and Bernie, if they stiff Bernie, if they shut him down, if they ignore him, if they block him, then you'll have something further left of Bernie that will take up the cause, just like Bernie is further along than Occupy, is bigger and stronger and more surprising. So this is a system that is breaking down its capacity to govern at the same time that it's building up its own critics. This is a system whose historical time is running out.
Okay, that was Richard D. Wolff. Thank you so much, Richard Wolff. I'll probably see you at the Left Forum this May.
Okay, and please, if you can, send me a link, and we'll post this interview as well.
Thank you so much, Richard D.
All right.
Wolff,
Take
economist.
care.
Okay, you too.